Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to a very special online event today. It's called The Alchemy of Fairy Tales and Jungian Shadow Work. Transmute your inner shadows into the gold of realized potential. My name is Stephen Dynam, the founder and president of the Shift Network, and I really am loving what we're going to be doing today because this is a big coming around for me. A lot of early studies in transpersonal psychology and psychology. I loved Jungian work, shadow work, and today we're going to get to dive deeper into the transformative potential in these realms, and particularly connecting to fairy tales, which we haven't had a chance to explore much in Shift, but really are part of the deep archetypes of humankind and the human experience. And when we can really work with those, it gives us deep insight into ourselves and ultimately our contribution in the world. So we're going to get to have this exploration with our faculty member is Melissa Kim Corter. She's a depth psychologist and an author, and she's also going to be teaching a brand new program through Shift called Jungian Shadow Work and the Alchemy of Fairy Tales that we'll share more about towards the end of the hour. So with that said, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm honored and so thrilled to be here and to jump into this subject.
Great. Well, let's dive in. And I would love to start with a little bit about your journey, since we're talking a lot about fairy tales. Like maybe even share a little bit about how has your life path mirrored some of the themes in fairy tales, and how has that led to some very interesting insights for you?
Thank you. There's so many things. There's so many things when I reflect back. It usually brings me into my childhood. I was kind of a strange kid. I was highly intuitive, empathic. I didn't know at the time what that meant. I didn't understand that I was attuned to other people's emotions. So I often would see, sense, and feel experiences that I had no conscious awareness of. I just seemed to say things and they would have meaning, or they would sort of come about a little bit later when information would come forward and somebody would say, "How did you know that? Who told you?" But I never really had any source for this knowledge or knowing. It was just something that kind of came to me and through me, which was often very confusing as a child, being intuitive, but not really understanding it, not necessarily having people who could nurture that. And so that created tension. It created confusion. And as a kid, it also led me to feel really uncertain about the world, the environment I was in, the experiences I was having. So what I would do is retreat to the woods. I spent a lot of time in the woods. And one of the things that I would do to kind of decompress and to let go of all this confusion and all these difficult feelings and emotions is I would play these games in the woods. And the one game that I would come back to over and over again is turning these stones. I would like kind of dig and want to uplift the stone and see what was underneath there. And I noticed this really strange sensation. On one hand, there was this magical feeling of what's under there? What am I going to discover? What am I going to find? But at the same time, there was this tension of fear. What am I going to find? What else could be under there? And these two sort of oppositional experiences of possible magic and possibly something scary seemed to really captivate me. And a lot of the things that I had interest in, movies, literature, fairy tales, stories, a lot of them had that tension. I didn't know it at the time, but I was drawn to these things. And so I learned to navigate the world by reading these stories, resonating with the protagonist, whether it's Little Red Riding Hood or Vasilisa and Vasilisa the Beautiful. And there was something about these stories that allowed me to recognize patterns in my own life. They gave solutions. They had this magical and enchanting sort of quality where the natural world was alive. And that really resonated deeply for me because I felt that way in the woods. It was like everything was alive, nature, the earth, the elements. And so I spent many years in that place of asking questions like, who am I? Why do I feel these things? Why do I sense them? Why do other people around me not seem to have that same type of connection? This led me into a really dark period of my life where some of us might say we veered off the path. We just got involved with the wrong people, the wrong things. But ultimately, what I've learned is that I was a seeker. I was trying to understand myself. I was trying to understand this sense of not fitting in and not belonging. And before I discovered that that was actually a gift and a blessing, I had to really make peace with this part of me that felt like there was something wrong with me, that there was something maybe broken. And that's really what propelled me into the work. I started to attract mentors and teachers. I started to notice I was just led to different meditations, schools of thought. And I followed that, just sort of like the breadcrumbs that we have on the path. You know, if we pay attention to these synchronistic moments. And I did that. I was like, there's got to be something to this, even though it didn't feel very comforting or soothing to have that level of intuition and depth. I felt like there's got to be a reason or a purpose. And ultimately, it really did lead me into the work that I do today. Because even though I'm not necessarily in the woods flipping stones and those kind of things anymore, I do see my work as really working with other people's psyches in that way, that same type of curiosity. Like, I wonder what's underneath this. I wonder what's behind this thought, under this obstacle. I wonder how we can see this differently.
Mm,
And so that curiosity also is something that became a gift instead of what felt like this burden early on.
mm,
And all of those things led me to discover depth psychology, which was sort of, I guess you could call it almost a bit miraculous. I didn't even know it existed, but it is this amazing form of psychology that values the hidden parts of the mind, the unconscious. And once I found that, it felt like everything in my life made sense. Everything that was a challenge, an obstacle, all of the things that didn't feel like they quite fit began to click in place. And I realized these were gifts. You know, it's almost like I was experiencing these initiations, some type of training experiences through my life that led me to be able to help and support others.
mm. Well, thank you for sharing so much. I'm sure there's a lot of people can really resonate in your journey. And I love the metaphor of turning over the rocks as sort of like a first impulse towards depth psychology. So let's talk a little bit about the shadow. I mean, a lot of shadow work is associated with Jungian work, and it is part of like this reclamation of parts of ourselves that have been split off, abandoned, orphaned in one way or another, and that hold important gifts for us. And maybe share a little bit about the role of the shadow, why we need to look there, and then how fairy tales can become like a portal into different dimensions of our own shadow.
Absolutely. The shadow is such a powerful part of us. We kind of go back a little bit. The term the shadow self was coined by Carl Jung. And essentially, it's this idea that there's this psychic field, this part of our consciousness that is beneath our awareness. So it's something that exists. It's sort of like a container, is the way I like to explain it. It's actually not necessarily negative or bad, even though there's a lot of times it's attributed to negative qualities. But the shadow itself is just unknown. It's beneath our conscious awareness. It's a field that holds things for us. And it holds them in this neutral manner. So it's not trying to cause problems in our lives. It's not trying to sabotage us. That's actually what we do. But the shadow in itself is very neutral. It's a container that's holding all of these different elements until we are ready to integrate them into the personality. And the value of that is that the shadow, on one side, it will contain for us all of the parts of us that have been denied, the parts of us that have been repressed, things that we have deemed unacceptable in our attitudes, our behaviors, beliefs, ideas. And essentially, we push that down. And just because we push it down doesn't mean it goes away. And so what happens is it actually gets pushed into the unconscious, into this container called the shadow. Now, the beauty of this, though, is it doesn't just hold all of those like discordant parts. It also holds our unrealized aspects of self. Gifts, skills, and talents that we haven't yet discovered are also there. Parts of us that we just haven't brought into conscious awareness also exist within shadow. So the beauty of that is we really get to explore this hidden side of who we are, and we get to bring these things forward. And there's this liberation of energy. So whether we are healing something by acknowledging it, leaning into some type of uncomfortable circumstance, situation, changing a behavior, addressing a compulsion or a feeling. All of these different things are about the movement of energy within the psyche and from shadow into conscious awareness. Then what happens is as that energy rises up, we might call it material or shadow material, as it meets our conscious awareness, it becomes realized. This is when we experience this liberation of that energy. So now it's no longer sort of held, suppressed, pushed down. Now it becomes pure potential. And we can channel this and direct this into new ways to create our life experience, to enhance things, to integrate these different skills, gifts, talents, things that we want to bring into our conscious awareness. And we can do that by working through the shadow.
I wonder if you can give an example from a client's life that just, there's something that they really didn't want to look at in their shadow that became part of their greatest blessing, the gold that they can bring to the world.
I love this question. I actually have one of my favorite stories. I'm going to shorten it down because it's quite long, but I had a client I was working with. She came to me with a nightmare. And honestly, I love working with nightmares because they're very similar to dreams. And in this nightmare, she was being chased. She was chased by this shadowy figure. Now, our dreams will often show us what is not necessarily present for us in our conscious, awareness during our waking hours. We're busy, we're distracted. We don't always know what's happening. We don't always know how to interpret these subtle cues, the different things that the psyche is trying to reveal to us. So often what happens is while we're resting, those images come through, those movements, those concepts, the themes will come through in our dreams. So this client was having a nightmare about being chased by a shadowy figure. I taught her a practice and we walked through this process together, and it took some time. It took her feeling safe enough to confront whatever that might have been that was chasing her in the dream. It was a repetitive dream, so it repeated a few times. I think about 3 different times she had this dream. And what she realized is through a process we call active imagination, where you can engage with the shadow in a conscious way, where you're dialoguing with it. She did this. And what happened is the next time she had this dream, the shadow, she turned and she confronted it. And this shadowy figure turned into this almost like a scarf, began to kind of flow, but it fell to the ground. And when she looked down at her feet, she saw this fox curl up in a ball, and it sat at her feet. When we processed that dream, we reflected on it and thought about what was the shadow? What was it trying to say? She got to this place of recognizing that it was actually something that was trying to let her know that she was running away from her intuition. She wasn't paying attention to her instincts. There wasn't something trying to get her. It was actually a different part of her that she wasn't wanting to listen to. And ultimately, what happened is the thing she didn't want to listen to was intuitive guidance about a very specific business decision. And when she had this dream and put these pieces together, got really honest with how she was feeling. She said, you know what? It's not the right decision for me. I'm not going to proceed with that business decision. And ultimately, she felt relief, instant relief. The nightmare stopped. She started to see more synchronistic occurrences of the fox appearing in different ways. And that business opportunity actually imploded and turned into a huge nightmare. But she absolutely avoided the destructive potential that it had because she listened to the shadow. So it's a great example of how something appears on the surface, unnerving or scary or dark. But if we trust our souls, we trust that our psyche is really leading us and that we can work in tandem with shadow, that it's information, it's unfinished business. It's just something there that's been yet to be realized or integrated for us to work with.
Really great story and very illuminating. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about, oftentimes we hold a vision of the ego in somewhat a negative sense in spiritual circles, but maybe share about how you relate to the ego from a kind of Jungian perspective and shadow work.
Absolutely. I love the ego. For years and years and years, a lot of the studies and the things that I had participated in, I would always hear, the ego, we have to get rid of the ego, or we have to, just make this thing stop wreaking havoc in our lives. And ultimately, what I've learned through studying the psyche and learning about the different layers of the psyche and how energy flows through these various parts and the harmony between them, is that we have this ego. And through the Jungian perspective, the ego is seen as an energetic structure. We actually call it like a gatekeeper. because it is partially in conscious awareness and then partially just a little bit beneath the surface. There's many layers to the psyche, but the ego plays a huge role in what we are aware of and what we are not aware of. So we might also say it's the gatekeeper between our conscious mind and the unconscious part of us. And so often what happens is the ego instantly is deciding what is acceptable. So when we are sort of oriented toward the outer world, let's say, and we go through this phase. Many of us will go through this phase in life where we're learning, who are we? What are we doing? What is this life about? And what will happen is we'll become fixated. So the ego is fixed on an external orientation, meaning it cares and values what the outer world has to say, our status, the role we play, who we are, how much money we have, all of these very superficial sort of things. Not that they don't have deeper value, but when it comes to the ego in that regard, it's often something that has to do with power, control. And so what happens is we can actually work with the ego. We can shift its orientation. This actually happens naturally for us as we learn to work with it. But in the beginning, it can feel like there's a lot of resistance, discomfort. If the ego feels threatened, it will suppress information. If it doesn't want to recognize something about itself, for example, we might say, I can handle criticism. And then the second someone gives us some type of feedback, we might become defensive. So it's really about what we think, what we feel, what we believe, what we've been taught. But this early orientation of ego, it's not yet been broken down. It hasn't gone through what we refer to as this like ego death, where it's super fixed in a position. It wants to be right about everything. And anything that kind of bumps up against those ideas, those thoughts, those beliefs, it'll shut it down. And then it takes that information and it pushes it down into the unconscious. But the ego transforms. It goes through a transformative process. And essentially what happens is when the ego stops identifying with the outer world and it shifts its orientation to the inner world, we start asking deeper questions. What am I meant to do? How can I be of service? So the I of the ego, instead of the me, external orientation, we start to say, maybe there's something more to this life. Maybe it isn't just about getting all the things, having that specific role. Maybe there's more going on here. And then the ego starts to shift and it lets more information through. So as the gatekeeper, more information comes up from the unconscious, from the deeper layers of the psyche where we have the authentic self. We start to get this glimpse of who we might actually really be, independent of the roles we hold, our status, all the things that we can get caught up in. Those things start to break down as that reorientation occurs. And this is really important because this is a true transformation. This is where we know that something is really going on within us. It's not usually a fleeting experience. It can be difficult. It can be really uncomfortable. Sometimes this orientation, the shift of the ego from the outer to the inner is described as a dark night of the soul. So it can be a painful process, but we can also work with it creatively to soften the process, to help have more clarity and to bring some magic and enchantment into the process. So it doesn't feel so painful, but actually starts to feel rewarding. And we start freeing up all that energy that we're using that the ego uses to control and dominate and be right about everything. It softens and goes, maybe I don't know it all. Maybe there's more here that I can discover and I can learn about this circumstance or my life in general.
How can understanding of fairy tales help us understand all those dimensions you just described about how the ego works within our psyche?
I love this. It's such an amazing thing because on the surface, you think fairy tales. How on earth is a fairy tale a psychological tool? But here's the thing. When we look at the old school fairy tales, these original tales have so much wisdom built into them. And something that still remains in the old school fairy tales is the conflict and the contrast. They haven't been watered down. They haven't been changed for us to feel better about them. And fairy tales were once a way that children could actually learn about difficult scenarios and situations in life by reading this story and seeing what the protagonist can go through. And what we've discovered is that as adults, we can do the same thing. We can learn about ourselves. We can read a fairy tale. There's a very specific process that I share on how to do this. But what we start to do is see with a symbolic lens. We start to remove this idea that we're literally reading a story and taking everything word for word. And when we start to invoke this symbolic attitude, we start noticing patterns in the fairy tale. There will be objects that jump out. There will be symbols that become significant for you. There will be creatures that show up on the path that remind us that we're always supported. Sometimes those creatures that show up will tell us that there's some type of trickery or deception going on. And it sounds kind of childlike on the surface, but when you really dig into it, these fairy tales are psychological tools. They teach us how to be with contrast. There's very specific things within the tale also that reflect within the psyche. So, for example, when we set out on the path, let's say, in a lot of fairy tales, we'll go into a dark wooded area. This is symbolic of the unconscious, the unknown. We don't know where we're going. We don't know what we're going to find. The ego doesn't like this. The ego feels threatened by the unknown. It wants to be in control. It actually has a beautiful role of helping us to feel safe. So this is why the ego is not always bad. And so what happens though is in our conscious life, when we are going through these different experiences, there's quite a bit of resistance or pushback. Maybe we want to have certainty in the decisions we're making. But when we read these fairy tales, and specific tales are designed for different types of themes, we start to realize, there are things here that I haven't yet discovered. I'll find my way back on the path. I'll discover new parts of myself. I'll learn really important lessons. The fairy tales teach us how to be with conflict, opposing tension, which really is where our psychological growth comes from. So part of what happens with the ego is as it's shifting that orientation, when it's growing, it's learning how to be with tension. It's learning how to be with this oppositional energy, things such as good and bad, right? We start to challenge, what does that actually mean? Maybe things really can't be put in a box of good and bad. Maybe there's gray territory. And these tales will show us that. We encounter all these different creatures and themes and ideas along the way. And when we really start to pay attention, what I teach people how to do is how to listen somatically to the tale, which means you're listening with your whole body. You're paying attention to, how do I feel when I read this? How do I sense this when I notice that the protagonist gets into this battle or is stuck in this trap or is lonely on the path? What does that bring up in me? So the thing is, working with the ego creatively is what gives us access to the shadow material, because the ego, because it's blocking so much information, we need to get around it without alerting it that change or transformation are underway. So by reading these tales, studying these different aspects within the tales and learning what they mean, all of a sudden it's like we have access to our blind spots. And if we do it creatively, intentionally, it doesn't threaten the ego in the same sense. So then the ego actually softens a bit. It starts to let a little more information through. And then what happens is you read a tale and go, oh my gosh, I don't know why this impacted me so much. I didn't expect to be this emotional about reading this story, or I didn't realize I would resonate so deeply with this character and what they went through. So there's so many things that are revealed to us as we look at the tale. And what I love is that there's not necessarily a singular meaning for every person. It's extremely up to the unique way that you journey through that tale. This is why we're not looking at books and saying, when you see this, it means this. Instead, we are referring to your psyche to say, how are you being led through this tale? What's coming up for you? What are you noticing? And when we bring curiosity in along with the creativity, that's another way that the ego starts to respond to allow more information to rise up into consciousness, because it doesn't feel threatened. It feels like it's going along, right, in this story and this journey. Yet baked into that narrative are these essential qualities that are helping us in our process of individuation, our process of becoming who we actually are and discovering our resiliency, integrating all these different parts within the psyche.
Very cool. Can you give us an example, maybe from your own life, of like how that individualized interpretation of a particular fairy tale might have illuminated something?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of my favorite tales, and I'm still working this tale. I've been working with it for years now. Well, there's a fairy tale called Vasilisa the Beautiful. And even just how I started today, sharing about my childhood a little bit and my intuitive gifts, it was so difficult to recognize those were gifts, right? It just felt like a burden. I didn't understand what was happening. And when I first came across this fairy tale, in the beginning, I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview, but in the beginning of the tale, Vasilisa's mother is on her deathbed. And she gives Vasilisa, this little girl, a doll. And she says, keep this doll with you. This doll will go in your pocket in your apron. And when you feel lost, when you feel scared, when you don't know what to do or you don't know what's next, you talk to that doll and she'll give you all the answers. But you mustn't let anybody know she exists. And when I first started working with that tale, it was deeply emotional. I was overwhelmed. The tears just started flowing, and I started to realize, oh my gosh, I felt like Vasilisa, and my intuition felt like that doll. I knew it was real. I knew it was helping me on the path. I knew it had deeper meaning. And I also struggled with, but I really can't tell people about it because they don't understand or they don't know what to do with it. Or maybe even I'm not safe to express this. There was something about the tale and listening to the journey, watching what Vasilisa went through, her different challenges, obstacles, ordeals, the synchronistic occurrences that happened in my life while reading that tale overwhelmed me. And I didn't realize that was typical. I thought something really bizarre and unique was happening for me. Like, what is going on? The deeper I got into learning about analysis and fairy tales and Jungian psychology, it was like, actually, that's process. That's the process. That's what happens. So it isn't even just the tale we're reading in this book. We start to see the tale mimicked in our lives outside of us. We start to have these synchronistic moments that just make it so difficult to deny. And then you soften a little, you relax a little, and you go, oh my gosh, there really is a lot going on here within me, within this universe. And the tales become a way of feeling like we have some sense of conscious control over finding resolution, connection, working through problems. We may not be able to avoid certain conflicts and tensions in life, but we certainly can learn how to become resilient and to call on help and support. And the fairy tales teach us how to do that. One of the things that's also so great about this is the idea that surrendering, learning to surrender, opening to surrender, that's how the ego learns to receive. So there's something about reading a fairy tale where you just start surrendering a little more. You let go, you go, I may not have the solution to this problem that I'm going through right now, but I know I'm supported on some level. And you read these tales, and it reminds you of this innate connection you have with the invisible forces within and around you. And life takes on this magical quality that we don't need to just reserve for when we're feeling good or optimistic. We can bring it in to our challenges and our ordeals as well.
Hmm. I love your perspective on these things. And I know you want to, circling back a little bit to working with our own resistance, the ego's resistance to some of the symbolism that can emerge from fairy tales or unconscious in the shadow. I would love for you to guide us in experiential process of how you're combining other techniques to kind of do some of this deeper integration, alchemy, and help our ego relax to do that.
Excellent. I'm honored to be able to walk you all through this practice. And so, what I'm going to ask you to do is tap along with me. So, we're going to use an intuitive tapping process, which basically weaves in tapping or emotional freedom technique, a little bit of neuroscience, a little bit of Jungian psychology, some ego work for sure. And what I'm going to ask you to do is just follow along. So I will tap through the points and I'm going to say the words out loud. And what I welcome you to also do is repeat the words out loud. Don't worry about sounding silly or having someone hear you, because by activating the voice with intention and tapping, this is a really potent combination. And what happens as we do this process together is we really give the ego the ability to recognize I am safe. There's not a perceived threat here. And it's a sneaky, creative way to help it let go and not be so on edge, like, what's going on here? She or he, they're forcing me to change or go through a transformation. Because sometimes it will recognize when we are pushing against something and we're trying to force a change to happen, to make a pattern go away. And yet, if we can do it creatively and intuitively, with the ways that set the nervous system at ease, that put us into a more regulated state, we're more open to that change. So I'm going to invite you to follow along with me here. So as you move through this sequence, repeat the words out loud, moving through the points. I'll guide you. We're going to start with the karate chop point. So either hand, just going to start tapping on the back of the hand. And take a deep breath. Just tapping on the back of the hand. And now repeat the words out loud. I give myself permission for this process to work. Again, I give myself permission for this process to work. And one more time, I give myself permission for this process to work. All right, now we're going to move through the points, so feel free to follow along. You can watch me as we go. So inside of the eye, outside of the eye, under the eye, under the nose, chin, and collarbone. So that's going to be our flow. We're going to move through it very quickly. You can find your own rhythm, your own pace. And if at any time you feel stuck, just come back, watch, and follow along. Here we go, repeating the words, tapping on the points. I give myself permission for this process to work. Even if I don't really know how this works. I give myself permission for this process to work. As I surrender, my ego learns to receive. As I surrender, my body softens and relaxes. As I surrender, my brain makes new neural pathways. These neural pathways support my intentions. As I learn to let go and to trust, I'm willing to feel safe as I navigate the unknown. I'm willing to release my resistance. I give myself permission to discover something new about my shadow. I have no intention of shaming myself for my past experiences. But instead, I can bring them to light. So they no longer unconsciously drive my behaviors. This feels empowering to recognize that I can work with my ego in this way. It's just the part of me that wants to keep me safe. I thank this part of me for doing its job. And I give this part of me permission to find healthier ways to create safety. as I expand my capacity to receive, as I expand my capacity to honor my intuition, as I expand my capacity to be with my shadow. I'm willing to lean into the discomfort, to lean into the resistance, to discover something truly amazing. I choose to make it conscious. And I give my ego permission to support me in this intention. And so it is. And so it is. And so it is. Now I'm just going to ask you to close your eyes here. Relax your arms down to your sides for just a moment. Take a deep breath with your eyes closed. And just allow any energy to move through, any thoughts to come and go, maybe feelings, sensations. And at this time, just imagine that your ego is receptive. This part of you that acts as the gatekeeper. Imagine that with each breath, you're surrendering a little more. Exhaling the weight of the world, the weight of other people's expectations. Just imagine that as you surrender, your ego is learning to receive. Continue to breathe and relax. Inhaling, exhaling, just sensing how good this might feel in this moment. And feel a sense of gratitude and appreciation for showing up in this way, for softening the ego, opening to the soul, working in tandem with the magic of your psyche. And take another deep breath. As you allow the eyes to open, just pause and notice how you feel.
Thank you. That's lovely. Well, the understanding the mechanism of tapping is a little beyond this call, but maybe just share just a little bit about how the sort of fairy tale ego work and then this integrating with the tapping can sort of be optimized.
Absolutely. So one of the reasons that I bring tapping into this work is sometimes as we're reading the fairy tales and we're making these discoveries, we're illuminating these hidden parts of the mind, we're discovering our blind spots and different patterns. Sometimes in that process, we might be met with a little more resistance, a different type of resistance that begins to emerge. And I use tapping in a way to help sort of settle the mind, settle the ego, to feel safe to explore. So it's something that works in tandem with the fairy tales, helping us to navigate knowing that we can feel more peace and ease and comfort as we process information, as we heal, as we uncover things. We don't have to necessarily be digging into really difficult material all the time to feel a shift or a change. Sometimes we can just settle the body and the nervous system. And what will happen is our own process is already underway. You see, the psyche is self-regulating. And what's really beautiful about that is it already knows how to operate on your behalf to bring you back into balance. And so if we give it the time and the space to do that, we'll notice deeper connections. We'll feel that sense of comfort in knowing that our solutions are on the way. We can feel more empowered to tackle our obstacles and to actualize our desires, but we can also do it in a state of rest and ease and grace. So the tapping kind of helps us get there while the psyche is doing what it does to process information and bring things into our conscious awareness. And it also helps us to relax so that in that moment, we might widen the scope of what the ego lets through. So you might have an idea, an intuitive impulse while you're tapping, while you're kind of sitting in that still moment, while you're reflecting and feeling that gratitude, because the ego's not feeling threatened. So it's another creative way of giving us the time and space to be with anything else that might wish to integrate within the psyche from the work that we're doing.
Hmm. I really love your integrated perspective on this, and I wonder if you can share a little bit more about what fairy tales we might be drawn to and how we would start to really engage this as a sort of a portal into the deeper work that you've just outlined. So, where are you drawn, and then what do you start to notice as you're reading the story?
I love this question. Often I have people ask, what fairy tale should I work with? One of the first things I tell people to do is just go see what you're drawn to. You can do a simple Google search. You might have some books already that contain different tales, but notice the themes. You don't have to necessarily know the title of the fairy tale, but you can even do a little bit of research on certain themes. So for example, if I'm working with a client or student, or even for myself, if I'm struggling with the idea of, let's say, rejection or abandonment or betrayal, these different core wounds that many of us experience, I might go to a tale like Hansel and Gretel, and I might read that tale through that lens of how do I reconcile this difficult experience, because in this tale, in the very beginning, we learn the unfortunate truth that Hansel and Gretel are being thrown out of their home. Their parents, the mother has passed away, the stepfather has the father has remarried, they have a stepmother, and they're impoverished. They don't have enough food to put on the table. They don't have any money, and so the children, in a sense, are sacrificed. And it's like, let's get rid of these children. They're costing us too much. And that's a lot to really grapple with, in that type of a tale. Those aren't things we're used to hearing in this way, especially in tales that were seemingly designed for children. But when we start to read that kind of a tale and we confront those deeper, darker feelings, those feelings of how could this happen? Why would this happen? We start to see other things that show up, which reminds us that there's more than what we're seeing. So in that particular tale, there's some frustration, there's some tension, because what happens is Hansel decides to leave breadcrumbs along the way. And he's thinking he's being so smart and he'll find his way home. But then what happens is the birds come and the birds eat the breadcrumbs. And how many times have we been in a circumstance or a situation where we thought we had the path, we thought we had it all mapped out, and then something happens, some external force occurs, and it throws us into this disoriented state, and we've got to figure it all out again. Yet there's deeper meaning in that. So even in the tale, if we reflect on those birds, we might actually see them as divine intervention. Because sometimes what's disguised as a problem is a greater opportunity. And we see this so clearly in the fairy tales. In that specific tale, actually, the Hansel, in a sense, is almost feeling betrayed by the birds for eating the breadcrumbs and ruining his plan. And how are we going to find our way home? But actually, the children weren't meant to go home. So sometimes life has a way of setting us on a new path and saying, I had to intercept to move you over here. And when we make peace with that our plans sometimes don't go the way that we want them to, sometimes people aren't who we thought, sometimes we've made a mistake or done something, that we can find ways to navigate those challenges and learn from them. We may not always understand why something happened, but I do believe we can find deeper meaning that helps us understand it from that level of soul versus the mind that wants to know why. Because there's some things we just aren't going to be given that answer. So the fairy tale is sort of like this beautiful way of saying, this isn't your answer, but there are clues here. There's different ways to look at this, to think about this, and maybe we can try something on. Maybe we can shift the tale. We can try to find something else that stands out in the narrative that's capturing our attention. And this is often where profound healing happens for people, just through reading these different experiences. Forgiveness might come about. Sometimes we learn how to tap into anger or rage and process it in a healthy way. So these tales can be very reflective of what, not only what we want to achieve, but what the psyche is trying to show us. And it'll pop out on the page. We'll feel it in the body. There'll be an energetic or emotional charge that gets our attention and says, hey, there's just some unfinished business here to look at.
Well, you just have a really great perspective on this, and I think there's so much wisdom in what you're sharing. So I think now would be a great time to talk more explicitly about the upcoming course that you're going to be teaching and really taking people into an experiential dive into this work, this interface of Jungian shadow work and alchemy with fairy tales, as well as bringing in other tools like tapping to help integrate. So the program that she's going to be teaching is called Jungian Shadow Work and the Alchemy of Fairy Tales, Healing Psychological Wounds to Reclaim Your True Self and Inner Light Through Myth and Lore. You can find it at the URL shadowalchemycourse.com, shadowalchemycourse.com. There's no prerequisites. You don't have to have a background in Jungian therapy or even, any particular methodology. This is really if you're just curious about your own self and you want to go deeper and use these different tools and frameworks to understand your ego, the resistance, the shadow, what is the gold that may be hidden from you currently in view, and use the lens of fairy tales to access as well. So Melissa, you want to share a little bit more about your intentions for this program and what people will come away with, and then let's give a tour of the modules and what's coming.
Sure. I'm so excited. This program is such a creative and beautiful way for us to address our blind spots. We all have them. We all have these parts of us that we just can't see. We sense it, we feel it, we know there's more, and we all deserve to have a creative and safe space to explore these things and to do it in a way that can actually be fun and magical. So my intention with this is to also help you discover that maybe some of the things within your personality, within your life that you might have seen as strange or bizarre, or you're not quite sure how that part of you fits in with things, to learn to love that part of you, to see it as a unique quality or a gift that you've been given that is meant to manifest in your life experience in some beautiful way. And you don't have to figure it out, but if you trust your own process, which we'll go through different techniques on how to do that, through the fairy tales, through the Jungian work, you'll start to realize you're perfectly on path. You're exactly where you need to be. And sometimes we just need to feel safe and supported to reinforce that so we can keep trusting and following the intuition to lead us forward into that next arena that we're meant to enter.
Great. Well, module 1 is called Discover the True Role of the Shadow and How Jungian Shadow Work and Fairy Tales Can Illuminate It.
Yeah, so I love this because this is the beginning, right? This is our first module. So what we're going to do here is really set the tone for understanding the psyche. You'll get a little bit of a preview into what the psyche looks like, how it operates. We'll expand on the shadow, how the shadow operates, really setting the tone for us. We can start to cultivate that symbolic attitude and the importance of that. We'll have an introduction to a fairy tale, and we'll start to kind of play around with these themes, which will really help us as we go through the other modules. But we'll start to tap into the hidden side of what might be going on, what might be stirring for you in your life, and create ways so you can actually trust what's happening and feel deeply connected to your own process.
Module 2, expand your capacity for resilience, courage, and discernment through the Cinderella story.
I love working with Cinderella, and this story is a really powerful story. And the way that it's framed in this module is quite unique as well. We'll start to tap into how Cinderella was perfectly positioned. She is actually someone that has a huge role in her family to shift her ancestral lineage. And through this tale, we can discover how some of the things that we might have experienced in our life were also perfectly positioned within us. We'll start to talk about initiations and ordeals and different things that come about and learn how to see them differently so we can extract that hidden meaning and magic from the experience.
Module 3, attune to your calling amidst chaos and understand the deeper initiation of core wounds through the Little Red Riding Hood story.
This is one of my favorite tales. It can teach us how to pay attention to our instincts. We learn to see through illusions. It's so important that we understand why the persona operates the way it does, which is a part of the psyche, which we'll learn about, and how we can detect this and the necessity of that, of trusting our instinct and intuition. And this tale helps us to go within. It's one of those processes of shifting that orientation from the outer world to the inner. What does my intuition say? How do I feel about this? We learn to trust that and pay attention to subtle energy and find the value in that for our life experience.
Module 4, follow the breadcrumbs to your soul's path and learn to let go and trust the unseen forces in your life through the story of Hansel and Gretel.
So we talked about this just a little bit. We'll go deeper into that experience and recognizing how things are placed on the path for us. And it isn't necessarily about understanding the what or the who, but the how. And we'll start to peel back the layers on tracking and tracing our own psychology and the way that energy flows through us, what we are gravitating toward, what repels us. And we'll play with the tension of that energy so that we can learn more about what it is the psyche might be trying to share through discomfort, through tension, and different energetic forms.
Module 5, explore the importance of staying aligned with your truth and learning to trust your intuition through the fairy tale Vasilisa the Beautiful.
So this is where we start to consult with the doll. We learn the value of the doll through the tale of Vasilisa. We're also introduced to Baba Yaga, which is known as grandmother witch. And these types of forces are tricksters. We learn a bit about the trickster and how this energy shows up and how on the outside it might be unnerving or frightening. But yet, if we learn how to stay present to these uncomfortable things, we'll discover there's something quite magical and amazing hidden beneath that facade. And it teaches us how to look a little more closer to the things that make us a little uncomfortable so that we can feel that energy liberated. So we're no longer feeling stagnant. We're no longer sort of abandoning ourselves in these processes of life or disconnecting or being distracted. We start to hone our energy differently and really value these innate qualities we have within us.
Module 6, unveil unconscious blocks to fulfillment through the fisherman and his wife and begin to shift prosperity complexes.
Through this tale, we can really illuminate some of the ways we might not even recognize that we're attending to our lives when it comes to abundance and prosperity, having enough, being enough. These are essential ideas that a lot of us grapple with. And sometimes it's not necessarily about what's in our bank account, but more about the quality of our relationships and our interactions and how we engage with the universe. And by working with this particular tale in this module, we'll really dive into some of the hidden and unconscious patterns that might be there and the potential that lives within that as well.
And finally, Module 7, break the spell of unconscious patterns and awaken into wholeness through the story of Sleeping Beauty.
I love this one. This is where we recognize that sometimes we go through a period of our lives where we're under a spell, we're in a trance. And when that's happening, it's not always that it's something that shouldn't be. Sometimes we're meant to be in these liminal states, these in-between times. And then there's other times where we're meant to kind of snap out of it and bring things into our conscious awareness. And ultimately, our goal in all of this is to recognize that all these different parts of us that we're discovering, that we're remembering, are a part of that process of coming back to wholeness and tapping into that, feeling ourselves as these whole and complete beings, not these projects that we have to constantly fix or work on. We can be evolving and healing and growing and deepening, but also recognizing our wholeness while we're doing all of that.
Well, what a beautiful program. And I love that each module is illuminated by a particular story as well. So again, it's all laid out in more detail at shadowalchemycourse.com, shadowalchemycourse.com. So in addition to the 7 90-minute live sessions you're going to have with Melissa, you also get recordings for every session, which includes both video and audio, as well as word-for-word transcripts to work with, study, and highlight. There's weekly exercises and practices you can do at home. There's a Facebook community to support you and deepen your experience, as well as small group time to connect with other participants. And on the page, you'll see a number of extra bonuses that are each designed to enhance your journey. There's a 1 hour of video, audio, and a PDF workbook called Bewitched, Breaking the Spell of Disempowerment, Tools to Unveil and Transform Unconscious Patterns. Melissa, you want to share a little bit more about that bonus?
Sure, I love this. So you get a small little taste of the tapping that you'll experience in a deeper way within this bonus. And this is one of those practices where we start to understand what it is that's going on in the psyche, what's happening when we are caught in these different moments of feeling like there's a trance or we're under the spell of something. And we learn how to consciously begin addressing that so that we can sort of be our own hero in a sense. We learn how to be the one that awakens us from it. We don't need to have some external force or something else in life occur. We can actually consciously choose to do this. And this practice allows you to really dive in and to reveal some things that you might not have considered. There's some ancestral components, there's different ways of moving through the material. And what I love is that you can start with a different intention each and every time you use the tool that's included. And this way, it really can cover a wide array of experiences. So you don't have to use it for just one thing. You can work through all the different ego defenses. You can have different things that are rising up from the unconscious. So let's say different types of shadow work that you want to try on, you want to maybe step into. This tool can really help you as a supportive guide, especially as a self-paced product. That way you can work at your own pace. You can pause if you need to and really take the time to reflect and go a little deeper.
The great extra bonus, just that. There's also another bonus called Introduction to Shadow Work, integrate shadow elements into your awareness. You want to share more about that video?
Yeah, so this video is a deep dive. It is packed with a lot of information on shadow, a lot of layers. We have the science, the psychology, the layers of the shadow. I call it the anatomy of the shadow, the framework. I talk about how we operate, the psychodynamics of the shadow. And then also there's a really potent practice as well. It's simple, but it's intense and it's deep. And again, it's something you can revisit over and over again to address different things that are happening in your life, a different phase, a different season that you're going through. And it's really wonderful because you can pause and take the time to write in your journal and reflect. And that helps to really integrate some of the things. It's guided, so you can follow along. You don't have to really think. You can just sort of be present to the material, which is part of what helps it kind of take root a little further as you navigate the process.
That's great. What another great bonus. Very helpful. And there's one final bonus that you get if you sign up by midnight tonight. This is a way to encourage you to really tune in now while you've got the most exposure to what Melissa's been sharing and you got the sales page in front of you. And if you choose to move forward, you'll get a PDF guide called the Shadow Work Workbook, Explore Your Hidden Dimensions. It's all about demystifying the shadow. Want to share more about today's special bonus, Melissa?
I love this. So there's a lot of misinformation about what is the shadow, what is not the shadow. And so I have shadow myths. So there's some information in there so you can kind of read through and see what it actually is and how it can be a supportive function. It doesn't have to be this scary thing in our lives. But my favorite part about this offering is that these are prompts that I've used and tested for years on my clients. I've received enormous feedback on these specific prompts. I have people that are clients of mine that have been doing shadow work for decades, all different types of shadow work, and still they came to me and said, "What is this craziness that you've created here? I had no idea that all of these things were still going on, or that I felt that way, or that that was even in my consciousness." And it has been such a profound yet simple tool. And that's what I love about it, is it doesn't take a lot of time. It's more about your willingness to just be, to be present, and to let yourself move through the process. And you will be surprised what it is that rises into your conscious awareness.
Well, what a great extra bonus and a great reason to sign up today. So, what a beautiful program, Melissa. Really excited for this. Again, it's called Jungian Shadow Work and the Alchemy of Fairy Tales, Healing Psychological Wounds to Reclaim Your True Self and Inner Light Through Myth and Lore. And it's all at shadowalchemycourse.com. On the page, you'll also see there's a lot of great testimonials about Melissa, the quality and depth of her work. And we've kept the investment for this program very accessible. It's just 3 payments of $128 or save 10% when you pay in full with one payment of $349. The course is going to start February 25th and run Tuesdays at 1 Pacific, 4 Eastern. But even if you can't make the live times, you can still get the full value with the recordings, the transcripts, and the community as well. There's lots of great testimonials, as I mentioned, and just a lot of reward as you go deeper on your journey of transformation and self-understanding and healing. This is real alchemy in doing this work. So you're in really good hands if you choose to move forward. So Melissa, we're nearing the end of our time together. Any final thoughts for folks who are considering going further with you in the full course?
It is just my absolute honor to do this work. I'm thrilled to be here and to welcome you to join us in this space, because this is a space where your unique gifts, skills, talents are not only celebrated, but honored deeply. And it's my hope that you will tap into more and more of who you actually are, and find the innate value of just becoming who you've always been meant to be, and realizing it doesn't have to be something that we set out to do, that we know where we're going. It can unfold organically. And we can do that together in this space with these creative modalities and tools that are designed to help you explore your blind spots while supporting you on your unique path of individuation, so that you can re-enchant your life and discover whatever is in the psyche, that potent magic that waits for you within the shadow.
Hmm. Beautiful. Well, it's again all laid out in detail. It's Shadow Alchemy course. Your passion, your enthusiasm, depth of wisdom is really very palpable throughout this hour. Thank you, Melissa, for this time. And a final reminder that if you choose to move forward with her full course, you'll get the Shadow Work Workbook when you sign up by midnight tonight at shadowalchemycourse.com. So thank you so much. Many blessings.
Thank you.